this was a remarkable story that started to get a lot of attention over the weekend. I wanted to share it with you. A woman at the Equinox chain of high-end gyms named Robin Europe, who is herself a former professional bodybuilder. She says that she was discriminated against at the Equinox Club, and she sued them and won an $11 million judgment. This is in Manhattan Federal Court. Now, as a matter of record, Equinox, Clay, have you ever been to an Equinox?
One time. I know this is a super fancy gym for people out there who have not been.
It's not super fancy. It's just not, it's sort of
it's not Planet Fitness. Well, Planet Fitness, right? It would cost a lot of money.
It's the Target of gyms. It's sort of
oh, really?
No.
I'm thinking of it as fancier than
maybe it's more like the
gyms.
Neiman. Maybe it's more like the Neiman Marcus of gyms.
I think that's a better. I think that's a better analogy.
That's a better one. All right. But I've belonged to several of them in New York. I know you wouldn't necessarily know that, folks, but I've, just from the photos. But I've belonged to several Equinoxes in New York. And she sued. She won $11 million. But as a matter of record, she was late for work 47 times in 10 months. 47 times in 10 months. Now, Clay, I've had employees. You've had employees. You're late once, it happens. You're late a few times over the course of a couple of months, stuff happens. You're late 47 times in 10 months means you're almost late 5 times a month. That starts to feel like chronic lateness, which is generally grounds for termination. And what's interesting is the stuff that I'm trying to think. The case revolved in large part around allegations that a manager who reported to Miss Europe, a middle-aged white man, this is from the New York Times, whom she described as insulated by his relationships, refused to accept her as a supervisor. She claimed he repeatedly delivered his vulgar takes on black female bodies, referred to non-white employees as lazy, and expressed the hope that he could get them fired. So she says a subordinate employee that she could fire, I would assume she is his superior, or could at least take action against, said stuff that she didn't like. There is absolutely no record of this. It's just she said that a guy said some things, and she was late 47 times, and she got $11 million. And you sit here and say, she's probably in this role. I know. I actually have a friend a friend of mine's a trainer at Equinox. She's probably making $80,000, something like that. And she gets $11 million. To this, I just want to say, first of all, wow, what is the burden of proof here? Oh, there's a white guy at my office who said some stuff, who works for me as a subordinate employee that I took no action against. He said things that I don't like, that I found discriminatory or whatever. So I get $11 million now? Why not $100 million? I'm just wondering, how do you come up with the $11 million verdict, Clay?
Well, hopefully this is one of those cases, and again, I've not seen the full case, but hopefully this is one of those cases where there is a substantial ground for appeal, because it's not uncommon that sometimes a jury will act in a method or manner that's irrational in terms of the verdict that they return. If you're right, Buck, and this woman was making, let's say she was making $100,000 a year, because it makes the math easy, that would mean that she would need to work for over 100 years at Equinox to make $11 million.
I really mean this. Can I get a job somewhere where first of all, I've had tons of jobs where people have been, said all kinds of things I didn't like, especially when I was in a subordinate role, treated me poorly, said stuff that, whatever. Can I get a job where someone says a few things that I don't like that make me uncomfortable, and in a few months' time I get a payout for $11 million? Get me this job. Get me this job that's so horrible that you get $11 million.
Most of the time you don't make 100 times what your salary would be because somebody says something mean to you, even if it's true, particularly when you weren't a very good employee in the first place.
So I just told you the story of a personal trainer fired from an Equinox gym in New York City, claiming that a white subordinate coworker, a white male, said things that she found bigoted or racist about, I guess, other people in the gym. And she was late enough that she certainly could have been terminated on that grounds alone. But she instead got $11 million. And I sit here and I say, and Clay's telling me, well, maybe that will be reduced and we'll see. But also when I looked at this story, something else came up. Some of you may recall this was back in November of 2022 that a black female FedEx supervisor, a supervisor at the FedEx company, won a, did you hear about this, Clay? $366 million jury award in a case where there was supposedly racial bias. It's fascinating. Whenever I read through these news reports on the racial bias, I'm looking for, oh man, where what is this stuff? Where are the grotesque, racist, really degrading things that we could all sit there and say, well, that is appalling, and the companies shouldn't be held $366 million is crazy, but there should be an award here. And it's always, I didn't think, in this case, I didn't think I got promoted when I should have been. And I think there was discrimination against me. I've seen nothing in this case now, granted, I've only done a quick read of it in the last few minutes, but nothing to justify a $3 million settlement, never mind a $366 million. I mean, I don't know. I think $366 million is a lot of money. And I think what you're starting to see is people might recognize that this all has costs and consequences. When you're going to get people getting $300 million verdicts or even $10 million verdicts, that expense is not just coming from, up in the air, the ether, or whatever. These are companies now that are going to have to be paying out this money. Now, sometimes it's covered by insurance, but their insurance rates go up. What happens then? You're going to be paying more for your gym membership. You're going to be paying more for FedEx if these kinds of verdicts become the norm, which I think you're starting to see. This is getting way out of control. Now, the New York Times, to be clear, is celebrating the $11 million verdict. They think this is great. $11 million for somebody who says she heard some things she didn't like at work. And I sit here and I say, when do we get to point out that that there are certainly instances of this where it's just people looking for a massive payday, or it's people who are using the racial guilt in this country and the terror that companies have of being considered racist for a second to just absolutely ring the cash register as much as possible.
Most of the time, Buck, these cases will get tossed on appeal, the verdicts, because that's why I was pointing out, let's say this woman's making $100,000 a year, okay? She got 100 years of salary because, according to her, some people at her employer said mean things about her. So usually, there would be the plaintiff lawyer and the defense attorney would sit down and say, okay, like, this number is totally out of whack. We'll give you $2.5 million settlement, or we're going to appeal this and your client's going to lose most of this verdict, right? Because, again, under a lot of different law, oftentimes, I don't know, the $300 million verdict is probably wildly outside of what a jury could deliver in those cases. Now, as an attorney, I represented a lot of big companies in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Can I just tell you,
Plaintiff's
366
Paradise
was not, they took it to court, Clay, to get it over. They took it to appeal. You know what happened at appeal? Maintained.
Where is the case from?
U.S. District Court of the Southern District of Texas.
So usually, again, sometimes you have to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get some of these cases tossed out. I'm not an expert in that particular case. There has to be, in order for a verdict to be applied, some sort of mathematical connection that typically would allow it to occur. So most of these massive verdicts that you see that are plaintiff involved, I'm not talking about a massive lawsuit, right? Sometimes you have these class action lawsuits where, theoretically 1 million people could each make $80 if they filled out the form and turned it back in. And really, it's the lawyers who are ending up as the biggest beneficiaries here because they get 30 or 35% of a contingency fee. There's no doubt that our court system is oftentimes strangled by unnecessary litigation. And an easy way to think about this is, if, Buck, we had half of the truck drivers that we have in this country, our entire economy would collapse. Think about it. If we had half of the lawyers, everything would be fine, right? So sometimes you can look around and you could probably say if we had a quarter of the lawyers, everything would be fine, because there is a tax that is being created by the legal profession in this country that does not make the country more efficient than it otherwise would be, by many lawyers often filing unscrupulous lawsuits that are unnecessary and actually make things worse for the vast majority of the country.
So jurors awarded Harris, a female, a plaintiff in this case, $1.16 million in compensatory damages. All right. I mean, if maybe there was something that she wasn't, fairly. She's making again, 80 to 100 grand a year. You're giving her 10 years of wages. Okay. They ordered $1 million in compensatory damages and $365 million in punitive damages. Now, you'd say, and to your point, I think that there's a faith here that you and I would both have in the system that say, oh, come on. Well, the update, that story was in November. The update as of February 3rd of this year was a Fifth Circuit judge rejected FedEx's request to throw out or reduce the $366 million in damages. So it made it to the appeal, and the appeals court guy was like, no, I'm sorry. So I don't know if they...
The way that typically this would work is it was a district court verdict in Texas. First of all, I don't know what the law is in the state of Texas on punitive damages. I bet we have geniuses who are experts on this. Typically, you could not reward a 300x punitive damage on top of a $1 million verdict, generally speaking. Sometimes, Buck, what you have to do, and this gets into the legal technicalities, sometimes you get a bad judge, right, on the Fifth Circuit. You might get, I don't know who that judge is, but my bet would be that he would have been a Democrat appointee on the Fifth Circuit, which is traditionally a conservative court in the country. And so you get a hearing in front of one, and you have to require that the entire Fifth Circuit review it.
So, I mean, it's making its way up the chain, but I just think it's interesting that this is the initial $366 million. They went to a district court judge, a federal judge, and said, hey, guys, the $366 million for discrimination that was apparently never proven. The basis for this is her perception that she was discriminated against. She was a black woman who says that they treated her differently because she's a black woman. And the judge said, no, we're going to keep it. So now they're going to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to elevate it beyond the initial federal district judge. But Clay, who is this initial district judge? This is crazy town.
Yeah, it is. And I would bet, again, that it's almost entirely unjustifiable under Texas law, because a lot of states have tried to put caps on punitive damages and damages in general, because what ends up happening in many of these tort lawsuits is this is a default tax on all of the citizens of Texas, because the corporation has to in some way count on all these dollars that otherwise would go to running their business, going out to people with unjustified payments instead. And
that's exactly what I'm trying to get at here is, this isn't, the juries think, oh, great, we're striking a blow against racism, even if no racism was proved, it makes a point or something. And this woman then gets very rich. Yay. People might get fired over this. I mean, you look at what happened. Now, it's very different, not a racial discrimination suit, but even the Dominion lawsuit at Fox, they had layoffs recently. Now, they can say that it has nothing to do with the $800 million settlement, but people lost their jobs. When you have a huge judgment against a company, they have to cut costs. People are going to get fired. So if you're bringing a frivolous or false racial discrimination suit and getting a massive judgment, there are good people that get hurt by that. And the consumer certainly gets hurt, to your point, about effectively socializing these costs, which we're seeing in a whole range of ways.
Well, and not only that, Buck, I mean, if you think in a bigger picture as opposed to one individual, which is, again, that dollar figure would be entirely unjustified. Also, many of the people who lose their jobs are minorities. If a company has to retrench and end up laying off lots of workers, then you're trying to rectify injustice by in some way actually taking out more of an issue on minorities to reward one, right? And this, of course, is the great fallacy of BLM in general. The biggest losers of all of BLM are impoverished people in inner city neighborhoods who can't walk outside safely because they fired all the cops in the name of trying to make the world less racist.
It's also just, it requires a total suspension of the reality that we all live in this country, where in 99% of corporate settings and circumstances, what's the fastest way to get fired, right? The fastest way to get fired, say something racist. No matter what company, no matter what business, no matter where you are, what you're doing, the fastest way to lose your job is to say something racist. And yet we're to believe that in these cases, there was all of this, grotesque racism underway that no one can prove and no one knew about, no one heard about. But look, it's because there's going to be more of this. I mean, Clay, from the attorney side of it too, right? $11 million here, $300 million there, starts to add up those legal fees, And this is where
can you think it's a good question for everybody else out there. How many professions could you eliminate half of the people doing it and actually make the world better? You could eliminate half of attorneys and America would work just as efficiently and effectively as it does now. How many professions can you say that about? Just think about it. And a lot of them that don't pay very well, the country would basically cease to exist, right? I mean, if you took away half of the people who work at gas stations, we'd have a real issue, right? Take away half the lawyers, country might be better off.